Hey, Gene, how are you doing?
Well done, Mike. Good to see you again. Hey, I have to begin with an announcement. I'm wearing a fairly unusual hat here,
Yeah.
and the viewers need to know what the story is. This is an original hat from the Homestead Grays, a great Negro League baseball team that played in the Washington area, and most guys of my age who wind up wearing baseball caps do it because they've lost all their hair, and it's sort of embarrassment. For better or worse, that's not my problem, okay? Just so you all understand. I will keep the hat off for the remainder of this conversation, but try to take me seriously despite the pandemic hairdo.
And
Okay.
is there a special meaning of the Homestead Grays to you?
Yeah, they were just a great team. That's all. And I like the Negro Leagues, and that's it.
Well, great. Good talking to you. I want to give anybody listening a little bit of context for our relationship, just because I'll ask a couple of questions that will allude to it. So, I came to work at the Miami Herald in 1983, and you went to work there in 1984 as editor of Tropic Magazine.
Right. I was actually there a few years earlier, but I
Yeah,
became
okay.
editor in '84. Yeah.
Okay, so beginning in the mid '80s, it was my goal and the goal of a lot of young writers at the Miami Herald to write for you, which I had the privilege to do. So that theme will come up as we're talking.
And
But
startlingly, you weren't bad at all. You had a little bit of talent.
well, I appreciate it. You had a little bit of talent of your own, and I want to talk a little bit about you've seen this world of writing narratives from both sides, from the editing and writing sides, though in recent years mostly as a writer. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about your sort of general philosophy of writing and editing narrative stories. What is it that you are trying to bring to this craft when you're doing it?
I used to be kind of infamous for a speech that I would give young writers when they came to me with an idea for a story. I would ask them what the story is about. And, they would tell me, what the essential subject of the story was. And I would say, no, that's not what your story is about. Your story is about the meaning of life. And, obviously I was being somewhat funny, but I was also being somewhat serious. And essentially my point is if you're writing a feature story that's going to take some time, you want it to be about two things at the same time. You want it to be about the ostensible subject matter, and you want it to be about something bigger. So, some universal truth that this story can examine. And an example that I've given is somebody once, it might have been Joel Achenbach, I can't remember who the writer was, came to me with an idea. He wanted to do a story on the closing of an amusement park. And I asked him what the story was about. And he said, the closing of an amusement park. And I said, okay, why are there amusement parks? And he said, well, because people want to have fun. And I said, that's right. And why do people want to have fun? And he said, well, to take their mind off their troubles. And I said, that's correct. And what are their troubles? What is the existential trouble we all face? He said, well, we're all going to die, probably alone. And I said, yes, that's what the story is about. So essentially, what I've always tried to express is that you need to look for a larger truth and deal with it in some way. And it doesn't literally have to explain the meaning of life, but it kind of has to approach some aspect of explaining the meaning of life.
Does a
Did that
writer?
question?
Yes. So does a writer have to have some deeper sense of what the meaning of the story might be
That's a great question. Yeah, and it gets to sort of the second point here. To me, if you're going out on a complicated story, I mean, we're talking about nonfiction feature writing. We're not talking about writing a story overnight or something.
Right.
You need to begin with a sense of what this is really about. The key is you need to have the strength of character to change that concept when the reporting does not quite fulfill what your conception is. Another thing that I've told people is that truth is always the best story. And to me, the biggest mistake feature writers make sometimes is that they will simply cleave to their original idea and then write a story based on research that they do to try to prove their idea. And essentially, you need to be able to be flexible. You need to be able to, at some point, to smack your forehead and say, this isn't what I thought it was about. But the truth is the best story. It is always the best story. And that, to me, is the biggest tool that a feature writer has to have. The ability to figure out what the truth is and change his or her approach as you're going about it.
So I'd love to know how some of these lessons and ideas apply to Fatal Distraction, right? The story that you wrote for the Washington Post in 2009, I think. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2010, if I remember right. One of the best stories of any kind that I've ever read about anything, and anybody watching this should know about Fatal Distraction and should read it. Ostensibly, the story is about people who leave their children in cars, accidentally leave them in the car, and the children die in the car. This tragedy that happens all too regularly, especially in Florida and hot states. So what is it about beyond that, and what did you think it was going to be about beyond that when you went into it?
That's also a really good question. There's a fact behind that story that was not in the story. I discussed it later. The idea was proposed by Tom Schroeder, a friend of both of ours, who was my editor at the time. And he called me up and said, a baby just died in a hot car. Do you want to look at that story? And what happened at that moment was that I almost threw up. There was this long pause on the call, and Tom had no idea why that was true, but it was true because I had almost done that to my daughter when she was about 1.5 or 2 years old. I came within seconds of having left her and you'll understand this, in July, in a car outside the Miami Herald building. And the only reason she's alive today and a veterinarian is that at the very last minute, she woke up and said something. And at that moment, I realized, you understand at that moment what almost happened. And, instead of her dying, I just pretended nothing happened and drove her to daycare where I was supposed to have dropped her off before I went to work. So something happened with that story immediately, which is that I found myself informed by a certain understanding, right, going into it from minute one of going into that story, which is that this could happen to anyone. And I knew that because I was not a bad parent. I was a good parent. I was absent-minded, but had it happened, I would have been demonized for the rest of my life. I'm not even sure I would not have killed myself. So I went into that story with that presumption. And, I would have changed that presumption, as we just talked about, if I discovered that the parents I talked to were in fact bad parents and idiots and, whatever, but they weren't. And the second thing that happened with that story was that I knew that I needed to focus on one person primarily, even though I talked to, I think, 13 parents who had done this to a child. And the one that I decided to talk to was a woman who lived in Virginia. And I went to see her and was utterly appalled. She was not contrite. Her name was Lynn Balfour. And she was funny. She was utterly unsympathetic in the sense that, you know, she said, "I don't blame myself because it was a mistake." And after that first interview, which lasted a couple of hours, I called Tom and I said, "I need another subject. She's not appealing. There's something wrong here." And he reminded me, "Hey, idiot, remember, the truth is the best story? Go back." And it turns out there was a really complicated psychological thing going on, where if you are to remain alive after something like this happens, you have to get past it. And that dynamic wound up being a very important part of the story. So a lot of lessons there.
You know, it's not unusual for you to draw on personal experience in your writing. You know, you appear in some form or other, not in a sort of self-absorbed way, but your experience is reflected in your pieces over and over again. Why isn't the story of nearly leaving your daughter in the Herald parking lot in that story?
Yeah, that's a really good question also. Stop asking good questions. Ask some stupid ones that I can really kick out of the park. We talked about it. And number one, it would have forced me to make myself a character in the story. You know, you can't just suddenly appear and then go away again. And it didn't seem like the right kind of story to do that. But more important, I was talking to 13 people who had had like the greatest tragedy and crisis you can imagine in their lives. And it seemed to me that equating an almost moment with them would have seemed wrong. I might have put myself in the story if I had written this story 20 years before there was an internet. But as it happens, and this is what we discussed, I was going to do a chat on this story the next day. And Tom and I decided that's ethical. If I deal with it in the chat the following day, I'm not failing to disclose something that might be germane. So that's really what happened there. If I'd written this in 1979, we might have decided I had to put that in the story somehow.
We're talking to a conference of narrative writers, some of them incredibly accomplished narrative writers, others sort of figuring their way into this world. But I think all of them always questioning their own, the way that they conceptualize stories. And in my experience with you, conceptualizing stories is a hugely important part of your process. Now, Tom Schroeder called you about the death of a baby in a car and said, "Do you think you should look at this?" And so you did that. But often, when you're choosing a story subject, there's some kind of idea behind it that draws you to it. And so, talk to me about story conception and when a story is worth embarking on, because now in newsrooms, there's less time than there used to be to do these things, fewer people to do them. And so every bet is a big bet. So how does a writer know when to place a bet on a story?
Every bet is a big bet. That's interesting. You're right. I can answer this with an example. Another story I did that got pretty well known began with this chance moment. I came out of the metro going to work at the Washington Post, and there was this guy at the top of the metro playing a keyboard. He was playing Beethoven, as I recall. And he was a middle-aged man. He might have been 50 years old. He was unshaven. He was really good, like really good. And he had pennies in the cup that he had laid out. People were all going to work and they were ignoring him like he was, a nuisance to be avoided. And I threw in a couple of dollars and he looked at me with this wretched gratitude, for $2. And on the 2-minute walk from the metro to the post, I got angry. And I thought, wow, if Yo-Yo Ma himself had been out there, nobody would have noticed. They would have walked past him like he was a nuisance. And by the time I got to the office, I had decided this is a really good idea. And I called Yo-Yo Ma's agent and proposed that, he dress in jeans and a sloppy shirt and play before an unheeding audience just to see what would happen. And Mr. Ma was interested, but we never got around to, he was just simply too busy and we never got around to it. But the idea percolated in my head for 2 years until I read a story in an airline magazine about Joshua Bell, the great violinist. And he was funny. And I thought, this guy might do this. And he did. And, it turned into a really interesting story about, not about our sophistication. This isn't really about, it wasn't about people's understanding of music. It was about how harried our lives are and so overprogrammed that we can't take a second to just think, holy crap, that's something really interesting and beautiful going on, 15 feet away. So, the ideas just sort of come based. You always have to kind of be thinking, because in my case, I'm always desperate for ideas. So whatever happens in your life, my first thought is, could this be a column? Could this be a story? And that's sort of what happened there.
So your premise on the Joshua Bell story was that people will not, in the hurly-burly of daily life, people will not recognize beauty, even if it almost jumps up and bites them. And so you expected that to be the result going in.
It is, I think, the only story I ever did, only big story I ever did, where my expectations were exactly right. Usually I'm wrong in some area or sometimes in totality. In that case, what happened was exactly what I expected to happen. Nobody noticed. And, had a crowd gathered, had a huge crowd gathered, had somebody stopped and said, that's Joshua Bell, and then suddenly, it would have been a story still. It just would have been a different story and probably not as good a story.
I would think not as good a story.
I would think not as good a story.
Yeah.
But, I started that not knowing what would happen.
But you had an expectation that we live in a world where people ignore beauty that's all around them. And had you been proven wrong, then you would have had a less good story. So you had what they call an agenda going into that story. Is that okay to have an agenda like that?
Sure, because in this case, I couldn't control the agenda. Mm-hmm. I wasn't doing anything to make people not notice him. And the truth is, I haven't allowed myself to think about this too much because it would be stressful. But I do think there still would have been a story if a crowd gathered. It would have been probably a lesser story if a crowd gathered because someone identified him and then people were showing up simply because, whoa, here's a free concert from a famous guy. I think that if a crowd gathered because people realized how beautiful this was, I still would have had an interesting story. As I said, I haven't spent a lot of time trying to figure out what that story would have been because it makes me nervous to think about it. But I think it still would have been a story. I will say that Joshua Bell was not happy with the way it turned out because this is a man accustomed to adulation, not just applause, but, he's been called the best violinist of his generation. And at the end of it, he was shaken. And I would say for years after this story, he'd be asked about it. And that's sort of the sad thing. This is a guy who's played before crowned heads of Europe. And the first question he'd get at a press conference is, well, that day that nobody noticed you in Washington. And it really bothered him to the point where a couple of years later, he called me and said, what if I do another concert that's announced in some public place? And we did it. We arranged for a concert by him at Union Station in Washington, D.C. And I told people, if you miss the first one or walk past this guy because you're a jerk, here's your chance. And thousands of people showed up. And it solved the problem for Josh. He felt good about it after that.
That's great. In that story, within the story, you described the story as a stunt. And in your book, One Day, in the introduction to that, you described that book as a stunt, where you say that, you're choosing, and I'm going to have you describe the premise of the book, but you're choosing a day in history and you're going to report stories that happened on that day. So I wanted to talk to you about stunts in journalism. Again, you're talking to an audience full of narrative and would-be narrative journalists. Are stunts, do you recommend stunts? And what are the right contours of a sort of a gimmick-based story?
Okay, first of all, if you're hearing a weird boinging noise, it's my phone and it's going to go off in a second.
Okay.
I love stunts. I'm addicted to stunts, but they have to be great stunts in the sense that they have to prove something that's true, just as opposed to being, hey, look at me and look at what I'm doing. One of my favorite stunts when I was an editor at the Washington Post style section was I had 5 writers come into my office, and I gave each of them a hammer and a nail, and they had to hammer that nail into a phone book. And wherever the nail stopped, at whatever name, they had to go and write a story about that person, and there would be no do-overs. They couldn't come back and say, that's a really boring person. They had to write a story about that person. There was a point to this. And the point was, if you have a good enough writer, there's a story in everyone. And they were great. The stories were fabulous. Would they have been less fabulous if I had not chosen the 5 best writers at the Washington Post? Yep, they would have been less good. It might not have worked. But, again, that was proving a point. One Day, which is a book that came out about a year ago, was the ultimate extension of that idea. I'd always preached that there's no such thing as an ordinary day, that if you have the skill to report it, any day would provide everything about the meaning of life. You would have pathos, you would have drama, you would have humor, you would have irony. You just needed to dig deep enough. And so when I got to be 64 years old or whatever, I decided okay, we got to test this now. It was a really stupid idea in the sense that my contract called for the book to be done in 2 years, and it took 6 years because the reporting was just a bear. But ultimately, I either got lucky or my thesis proved to be correct. One or the other, or a little bit of both. But yeah, the book is just filled with the human experience in all sorts of ways. I think I almost cried at the end because I was worried throughout the whole process that maybe I've been wrong all these years. Maybe in my mid-60s, I discovered that I had no idea what I was talking about. Maybe I was poisoning the minds of young writers by telling them crap, but it turned out to work.
It did work. It's full of great stories. And since we're doing the Mayborn conference in Texas, I want to talk to you about the, I don't know if it's the only one, but a story set in Texas, the story of Michael Anthony Green Jr. So this was a now young man who was saved from a fire in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas by a firefighter named Richard Lane. So you set out to write about Michael Anthony Green Jr. Describe Michael Anthony Green Jr. to us.
Okay, we need to go back for a second, which is to involve the reporting process here.
Okay.
It was very difficult to know what would be a good story and what wouldn't, because I was mostly working from news accounts from that day. The other thing people might not realize, the day was chosen at random by, I had children pull numbers out of a hat to create a date. So there was no rhyme or reason in which day we had. And in fact, the day proved to be the worst possible day imaginable. It was number one, it was a Sunday, and everybody watching this realizes that Sunday is the weakest news day of the week. It was the Sunday between Christmas and New Year's, which is the weakest week of the year for news. Nothing ever happens then. And the year was 1986, which rang no bells whatsoever for me, in terms of interesting years. So I began assuming this was just going to be a disaster. Anyway, so I was dealing mostly with news accounts from that day. And you never know what's going to work and what isn't. The news account with Michael Anthony Green was a one-paragraph story in, I think, the New York Times is where I found, I can't remember, but it just said there was this fire and one child died, a girl, and his brother lived but was severely injured. And so you have to begin by trying to find out, did he survive ultimately? Who is he? Where is he? And that brought me to Michael. Michael, because this was 1986, I guess Michael is now 34.
I guess, yeah.
He's hideously injured. He described himself as a monster. He's very difficult to look at. He has no hands. His face kind of looks like a soccer ball, and then it was stitched together from pieces. He's got scars all over his body. He's missing toes. He was just burned beyond recognition. And I arranged to meet him without really knowing anything about him. He's one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. For one thing, he has a sense of humor about it, to the point where, and this is one of my favorite facts in the book, he decided that on Halloween, he was going to rent himself out to a haunted house where where he would just leap at people from the shadows, and scare the crap out of them. What kind of a person has that sense of knowledge about himself and that kind of sense of humor? He has spent his whole life overcoming his disabilities to the point where his most recent job was a checkout person at a CVS. He's the guy who actually takes the stuff you've bought and he handles money without hands. And why did he do it? Because it was a challenge. Anyway, he's the person I most respected in this book, and I respected a lot of the people I was writing about.
There's something that you do in this book that I found just really interesting, and you do it a couple of times. You bring in some serious outside expertise to kind of assess this situation. You have a sentence at near the end where you say, in the lexicon of developmental psychiatry, global self-esteem is the phrase used to assess a person's overall sense of self-worth. And then you go on to do a little bit more about the sort of scientific understanding of self-esteem. And that introduces a section about Michael's Facebook page, where he's showing himself to the world and saying who he is, right? And then there's another place in the end, you go to a professor of psychology, molecular biology, and physiology, and you let him read the chapter. And you ask him
right up
about
to that moment. Yeah.
And you ask him about how memory works. You want to know if does Michael remember the fire? And you're asking this expert about whether he remembers it. So I thought that was fascinating, and I thought, is this something that we should be doing as reporters, is going out and drawing on and putting the names of experts and giving them sort of cameo roles in our stories?
I don't think that I would have thought of doing that. Michael thought of it. He, at some point, he got very quiet and he said that he was worried because this is the sort of depth of his story, the depth that it got into. He's essentially a happy man. He'd gone through psychological turmoil, obviously, but he'd come out of it on the other end, and he's a happy and fulfilled man. But he'd been having dreams. And I spent a lot of time with him, and it was not until maybe the last time we talked that he said this. He was worried because he'd been having dreams about the fire. He felt that he was in the corner of a room and the flames were licking at him, and he would wake up in the middle of the night with this horrible thought. And the reason it bothered him was really complex. The way he's been able to look forward in his life is that nothing before that fire, he remembered nothing about the fire. And so he only knew himself as the person he is. He didn't feel a sense of loss. He did have a photograph of himself as a baby, but by and large, it wasn't real to him. And he didn't want it to be real to him. He did not want to remember the fire, because if he did, he would feel, oh my God, I could have been something else. And that's why I went to my friend, the molecular biologist. Could he possibly remember the fire? He knew there was a fire. He just didn't want to remember it. And he didn't want to think that he's remembering it. And so I spent a great deal of time trying to figure out, if he could have remembered, I would have told him, the truth is the best story. The first thing that I did was went back to the firefighter who rescued him. And it turns out he was not in the corner of the room. He was in the middle of the room underneath a window. So that element of the memory wasn't real. But then I went to the brain scientist, and to ask, can you possibly remember something that happened to you at 1 year, 3 months old, or whatever age he was. It was not yet 2.
Right.
And he explained that you do not have a visual memory of things that happen at that age. There's something called infantile amnesia. It just, you had a memory at one point when you were little, but it gets overwritten in the brain. So that couldn't be a real visual memory. But he did say that there is an emotional memory that can hang over from very young age. It's why children who are raped as infants remain damaged by it, even though they can't really remember what happened, because there's an emotional component that can last. And he asked me to go back to Michael and I asked him if in these dreams he is smelling burning flesh. I mean, this is really close to the bone, you know? And I did, and he said, no, it's purely visual. And so I was able to tell him and end the chapter by saying, there's nothing real in your memory. It's nothing more than a scary story told over a campfire. And, you know, I left him with a sense of peace over this, and it made me feel good.
And so the expertise of the molecular biologist gave you the tools you needed to make that declaration in the end that, Michael, this is not a memory. It's
right.
It's a story you're telling yourself. So as a reporting tool, that was really important in the end.
Yeah, I think, you know, seeking to broaden the story through expertise is never a mistake. It might not work. It might wind up being more boring than helpful, but you make the effort to do it.
You end the story. You end that particular chapter, and I'm going to spoil it for some people, but you say, Diamond says you are reliving nothing in those dreams, Michael. They aren't memory. They're invention. No more real than a scary story told around a campfire. You can stop worrying. You're good to go. So that strikes me as a very confident thing for a journalist, for a feature writer to do, to declare to this guy, you're good to go. And I'm not questioning it. I loved it. But what I wanted you to talk about a little bit was the confidence, how you acquire that confidence in your voice to be able to say, this is how it is, reader, at the end.
I think the answer is no more complicated than you have to do the work. You know, David Diamond, the expert I talked to, was very clear to me in how it, you know, and this is a leading international expert on how memory works. I just felt able to do that. I think if I hadn't felt able to do that, I wouldn't have done it. You know, there's always, you know, you and I both know there's always an impulse to reach for the most dramatic thing to write. But you need the strength of character. And I'm sure I've made this mistake before. I don't know when, but you need the strength of character and say, I can't really go there. There was a story that didn't get into the book that sort of tested this. You know, again, I started with literally hundreds of news stories and accounts, and, you know, you throw them away as they seem not to be dramatic enough or true, or you can't confirm the truth of them. One of these stories happened in Florida. And on the day that I was writing about, a 3-year-old boy climbed 40 feet up a tree because he wanted to see, he was fine. The firemen got him down. He wanted to see planes landing at an airport 1.5 miles away. You know, how a 3-year-old can get up 40 feet in a tree, I have no idea. But, you know, I wound up talking to his mother, and the phenomenal denouement to this story was that he became deeply mentally ill, wound up committing crimes, being institutionalized, you know, and part of me, despite the tragedy of this, I was thinking, yes, this is really interesting. And so I talked to early infant development experts, 2 or 3 of them, very well-known people, and they all agreed that at 3, there is no way of predicting from behavior whether it would result in mental illness. They were very clear on that. Not one of them said, yeah, climbing up that tree was a suggestion that he was going to wind up. And I just felt I couldn't go with the story, because without that connection, it really didn't mean anything. So that was one of my big disappointments. But you just have to make that judgment. The story of a kid who climbed 40 feet up a tree is interesting, but it's not interesting enough to use in this book unless you can connect it to future events. And I just felt I couldn't do it.
So this ending that I see as confident is really just the ending that you're always going for. You always want your reporting to be able to support that kind of strong declarative, either ending or statement in your story.
Yeah.
Right. Recently, Gene, I've been following you on Twitter, as everybody should, and recently you've been in the throes of a story that I know has been pretty painful, because you tweeted, "I've never done a story harder than the one I'm working on right now. If you have a child, please do anything necessary to dissuade him or her from being a writer. Jizzmopper is a better career." What can you tell us? What can you tell us about the story and why it was so painful?
I can't give you too many details because it's not coming out until November 1st, but I can describe it generally, and I think every writer in the room will understand the problem with this story. The Post asked me to do a story that would appear as a magazine cover story 2 days before the election, which is when this will run. Assuming it's accepted. I just sent it in. For all I know, they'll kill it. But and the idea of the story is not to predict what will happen. I wound up falling into that trap 4 years ago, and I had to retract a column because it was very clear that Hillary Clinton was going to win that election. And I actually wrote a column 3 weeks in advance on the assumption she had written. So the idea was not to predict this, but to examine whether the country can pull itself together, given how fractured we are, regardless of the results. How do we come out united on the other end, given the fact that this administration has polarized people to the point where they hate each other. And anyway, that's the idea of the story. And the problem, and the reason that this was so hard, is that I am not unbiased. And I couldn't claim to be unbiased. The things I have written in my humor column about Donald Trump are unbelievably negative. And so how do you deal with that fact in a story? I'm not, what's the term? I'm not an honest broker, as we all try to be when we, especially when we're writing about politics. And so I had to figure out how to deal with that and still write a story that was fair. And that's the thing that drove me nuts. And the way I decided to do it was to be utterly transparent about what I think about Trump, and then talk to people who disagreed. And it was a real tightrope. It was not easy to bring this home. And I hope I have. I'll never find out until it comes out and people start sniping at me, etc. Trump won't like the story.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Gene.
I think it's ultimately a fair story.
I can't wait to see it. Is the writing process for you always sort of difficult and agonizing, or was this harder than most for all the reasons you just mentioned? You know, sort of give you a good story that that you really like, and you've got what you need. What's the writing process like for you?
Well, I do something very unusual, and I don't recommend it. I'm not telling writers, follow my lead here, because it's a little bit insane. When I'm doing a big story, one that takes weeks or months, I will take good notes. I tend not to record things. I just take very good notes. Before I start writing, I will sit down and read the notes carefully. It could be a 2 or 3 day process. And then I'll lock them away. I won't look at them. And I'll just start writing based on my memory of what happened and what I have. And I do that because it tends to bring you to an ideal. You know, you're not chained to your notes. You're not having to go back and say, well, what exactly did he say? You think what you think he said. And usually you get it right. I get it right. But sometimes when I'm done, I'll go back to the notes and realize, oh, crap. He didn't express that as well as I, said he expressed that. And the reason I do it is that it's a tool, because if he didn't express that well the way I thought he had, I can get back to him and see if we can rediscuss it, and maybe he'll go in that direction. It helps me frame the best possible story that I can do, that I'm capable of doing. Again, what you need is the strength of character to say, I can't say it that way. It's just, it's a very weird process. It requires, as you said much earlier, it requires a lot of time. And, I fortunately am given the luxury of that time. And I think fewer and fewer writers get that luxury, not because they don't deserve it, but because there are half the number of writers in newsrooms, and there's more pressure on them to do something now, tomorrow. So I feel lucky in that sense. This last story was not, I probably spent 6 to 7 weeks on it, which is not much for me, because it had a very solid deadline. It has to come out before the election. But by and large, I spent a year on a story, and I just consider myself very, very lucky to be allowed to do that. You're famous for giving your writers time. I mean, I really admire that. How did you?
So I've worked at institutions where narrative storytelling was valued before I got there. Like the St. Pete Times had a great tradition of that, and I just joined that tradition. Like to think that I extended it at the Dallas Morning News, but I did it because I saw the effect of giving people time, or saw the effect of being given time when I was at Tropic. So that was really, it goes back to our origin story as of working together. Gene, when you were talking about I'm trying to keep the audience in mind here. You have a lot of sort of working daily journalists and student journalists maybe who will be listening to this. It strikes me that for one day, you said you relied on a lot of newspaper clippings to guide you into stories. How good a job are we doing out there of providing a writer like you with the kind of inspiration that you need in a story? And what lessons can we take from what you found in the clips?
There's sort of a sad understory to this, which is, I wound up investigating these stories microscopically, going back and talking to people involved in it. And I do have to say that a fairly shocking percentage of the original stories got central things wrong. It bothered me a little bit. and another thing that I think journalists know is that when you talk to an expert involved in a story, they will often tell you, yeah, they got it totally wrong. You know, some of the things that I read were brilliant, you know, and I tried to give them credit in the book. Some stories I abandoned because the initial story just got it all wrong. One of my favorite stories that didn't get into the book was that on the day that I was writing about, engineers in Connecticut had flown a plane that was built as an exact replica of a plane that a guy named Gustav Whitehead had built in, I'm not good on the year here, but 2 years before the Wright brothers, that allegedly flew on that day. It was a story that essentially said the Wright brothers did not invent the airplane. And there were two problems with the story. Either of them I could have elided over fairly. The first was that this plane looked like a bird. It practically had feathers. And, you know, the fact is, even if it had flown on that day, this was not going to be the prototype of the airplane. The Wright brothers was going to be the prototype, you know. But the second problem is that the newspapers got it wrong, and it didn't happen on that day. It happened the day after. And I spent a good week or two on that story, and I had to kill it.
What are we not doing? What could we be doing to improve the accuracy of the next, you know, century's worth of clips for the next person who does a one-day book? You know, for daily reporters out there, what can they be doing?
Probably nothing. I think that in general, we are doing a good job. It's just, you know the expression, the first rough draft of history. Rough should be emphasized, but I think by and large journalists still are doing a terrific job. You know, I keep seeing the Washington Post got purchased by Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos is an inexhaustible source of money. He's been, you know, you can say what you want about Jeff Bezos, but he really saved the Washington Post. And we are doing some incredible journalism. And every day I look at the paper and there are new names writing stuff. I mean, we're hiring. Yep. And we're hiring people I had no idea who they are. Some of them are very young, and I'm just wildly impressed by their talent.
Tell us, I want to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but two more questions for you. One is, what are some of the common mistakes of either conception or execution that you see in young writers' narrative work?
The biggest is one I mentioned before, which is that you have an idea of what the story is supposed to be, mm-hmm. and you steer the story to that. Whether or not the fact, you seek out the facts that support your idea, and you kind of ignore facts that don't. Actually, I will tell you one very quick story about something that happened to me many years ago. When I first got to Style, all new writers were assigned a really crappy story, sort of as a joke. But Style, at the time, covered parties as though they were news. We don't do it anymore. Mm-hmm. But, if the Italian Americans were having a party to celebrate Italian Americans, some poor schmuck reporter had to go there and write about the party. And I got assigned to exactly that story, the Italian American party. And there was a sort of interesting backstory, which is that it was initially going to honor, celebrate, and have as its main speaker Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, as it happened, died about 2 weeks before the party. And so it injected a kind of interesting element to it. And I went there armed with, I didn't want to do the story. It's an overnight. So I had like 2 hours to report it and 15 minutes to write it. And then this was back before we had computers. So I had to like call it in, And for the first hour, I went around and interviewed people about how much they liked Sinatra and, appreciated him as an Italian American. And I was noticing that the quotes I were getting were tepid. They gave me what I wanted, but they didn't seem enthusiastic. And finally, I had this slap to the forehead revelation. They don't like Sinatra. Because he made it very rough for Italian Americans. He was ostentatious and he was mob infected. And in fact, most of these people had serious problems. So then I went back and re-interviewed people with a different cast, a different kind of question. And, it turned into a way better story, way more complicated story. The other thing that happened was that I didn't have a lead, and there were maybe 5 minutes left to go before I had to call in the story. And at that point, Bill Clinton arrived as a guest. This was 1998. And the Lewinsky Scandal had just erupted. Everybody knew that this was going on, although nobody knew the dimensions of it or anything else. And I was sitting there trying to think, what do I lead with here? Because it was complicated. The anti-Sinatra thing was complicated. It didn't make for a lead. And during the whole event, they were playing an endless loop of Sinatra songs. And as it happens, the moment that Clinton entered, this is why you sort of always have to be aware of everything that's going on. Nobody else quite noticed this, but the moment Clinton entered, the Sinatra song began playing, "The Lady is a Tramp." I thought, oh man, there is my lead. So again, there's a lesson there. You sort of always have to be desperate for the best possible thing. I don't know if I just answered your question, but I
love it. As long as I've known you, Gene, I think you've been edited by, or you've been editing Tom the Butcher Schroeder. Tom, I don't know if Tom was the editor of your magazine piece, or if the magazine editors have taken that on.
Of this last
yeah.
piece? The magazine editors have taken that on, but I have never abandoned Tom as an editor. So let's just say he saw it before it went in.
Okay. Well, so I think that, I imagine, a lot of us imagine that your stories arrive on the editor's desk as these perfectly formed and realized pieces.
Nope.
Tell us about that, and tell us what editors do for you.
Editors do everything. I absolutely believe that every writer needs an editor. George Will needs an editor. And it's just because you have a certain blindness. All writers have a certain blindness. I'm a pretty good writer, and I screw things up. There is the story that I just handed in. There's a young copy editor at the Post named Angie Wu, who just saved me from 3 or 4 terrible mistakes in her editing. And this happened yesterday. We all need editors. We need the strength to resist bad editing. I'm being honest here, but sometimes an editor, including Tom, who can be a complete jackass, they'll just make a suggestion that's wrong, and you need the strength to push back. It's not a good writer who simply accepts whatever an editor says, but you also need to understand that you're not perfect, and a second intelligent eye on the story is always valuable.
I want to use the moderator's prerogative to tell a story here to close this, but it's a story very relevant to you and your work.
I'm not sure I want to hear this, but.
So in 1985, I was a young reporter at the Miami Herald. All I wanted to do was to get a story in Tropic magazine, of which you were the editor. And I wrote a piece about a radio DJ in West Palm Beach, Florida, whose life had come apart, and he ended up selling trinkets at the flea market. So I wrote this piece. That was 1985. Flash forward 8 years to 1993. I've done a number of other writing and editing jobs at the Herald, and now I am finally going to land my dream job as a staff writer on Tropic magazine. You've by now gone to the Washington Post. Tom Schroeder is the editor of Tropic magazine, and he introduces me in a column where he says, we knew we had a special talent on our hands when we read this piece from Mike Wilson about this radio DJ. And look at the prose that he wrote. And Tom quoted 3 or 4 paragraphs of that piece to show my brilliance. Every word that he quoted was written by you in the editing process. and not one was written by me. Let
me end with a similar story. In one day, my book, there's a single line in there that has been most praised. It is the only line written by Schroeder. So we share this.
Can you tell us what the line is?
I'm not sure. Wait a minute. Give me a second. This will be a bad way to end because I'm fumfering here. Yeah, it was the end of a chapter on a heart transplant, and the woman lived, and the line was she got the heart of a murderer, and it said that she.
I got it right here.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Eva is right. She didn't get a murderer's heart exactly. She got a broken heart. It fixed her and she fixed it.
Tom Schroeder.
That's fabulous. Gene, thanks a lot. Great talking to you. So long.